Now let's take a look at the scatter and align node to align our these clones. Here I have opened up my this previous scene where we were working with these normals for the alignment. And here as you can see, we can create the normals for the alignment. And now if I were to adjust my rotation of these guys, I can go into the transform node and I can just continue playing around with this. And by adjusting this one, I can adjust the rotation globally. And here as you can see, by playing around with the rotation, I can rotate all of my clones. But what if I were to only rotate a certain clone, not all geometry? Or how we can have a more control on over these orientations? So the one way we can do that by adding a com node, so which means that adjust these normals, because we know that these normals are responsible for our alignment. We can do so by adding let's say attribute randomize node. If I add an attribute randomize, and let's connect this after that, and as you know, by default it will randomize the CD, but for this time I want to randomize these normals, these n. I only just need to replace the attribute name, because we know that n is called the normal, so it is a capital N. Remember that it is case sensitive, so capital N and the lowercase n are not the same attributes. Okay, these are two different attributes. You must pay attention to the cases. Capital N is the normal that stored the normals, and here as you can see, whenever I type the n, and we have these normals oriented in random directions, and I can play around. Here we have the dimension, it is set to 3, which is a correct dimension because it has 3 values. It has x, y and z components, so that is correct. I have some other option. I can change this to direction or orientation. Okay, so the dimension is, I can play around with the cone angle, and here we have the bias direction. So the bias will bias this alignment onto these axes. Here I can define the direction. I can bias them toward my y-axis. Let's zero out the x, and now they should lean toward the y by playing around with this bias option. Play around with the cone, and now if I were to enable my copy to points, and let's go into the attribute randomize node and play around with these settings, and here as you can see, I can randomly orient these copies. I also have some option for the inside sphere. All of these different options to randomizing our copies. Zero it out, totally random orientation on each of these copies. How you can randomize your rotation, and we also have a node called comb. If I type comb in here, so that is the node. Let's connect this. What comb node will do, let me view this node comb, and when the node is selected, just select the node in the node editor and hover over to the viewport and press enter, and that will enable our manipulator, which means I can use the brush, and right now I cannot see my brush. Let's increase the radius of our brush to a bigger value, and right now I cannot adjust them, maybe because of the points are small. So what I can do, I can just remove the extract all points. Okay, we don't need that. And onto the sphere, let's maybe increase the number of copies, and now let's press enter, and here as you can see, let me enable my point normal display, and let me increase the radius. Sorry, we were actually accidentally I am changing the UV radius, so that is not the radius. We need to play around with this value. Okay, and here as you can see, now my radius is getting bigger. I was playing around with the wrong parameter. And here as you can see, I can use the comb node to manually just orient my normals. And by doing so, let me go into the copy to points node. And here you can see I can effectively, what I'm doing, I'm just adjusting the orientation. So when the node is selected, we just need to highlight the node, just highlight the comb node, hover over to the viewport and press enter. Now that we have the manipulator, I can interactively come over here and I can play around with these normals. And maybe let's decrease the number of points. And now we need to highlight the node to have its manipulator. I can manually play around with this. And that is one way of controlling your orientations. And we also have another node called scatter and align. If I add a scatter and type scatter and align, and here as you can see we have these two nodes, the scatter and align. So the scatter node is just simple, it will just scatter some points onto your input geometry. It will not create any additional attribute. If there is a normal, it will inherit them. As here as you can see we have these normal, and the normals exist, it will inherit them, but it will not create normals for us. It will just scatter the points, and here I can define how many points I like. But onto the scatter line we have some more advanced options. So let me remove all of these two nodes, we don't need the normals. Or maybe let me create another example onto this side in here. Let's keep this as is. And in here I'm going to create another sphere geometry. So let's create a polygonal sphere. Let's adjust the radius. And in here I can connect this scatter to the surface, and in here we have quite a lot of options for dealing with the alignment. So at the first we have the option for the coverage, so how much area of the surface it will coverage to scatter the points. I can enable the coverage to all the way up to 1, which means use all of the available surface, or I can lower down the surface area. And right now the point count method is set to size, which means it look for the size. We have the minimum and maximum radius. So it will scatter points in between min and max radius. And if I play around with the min and max radius value, here as you can see, I can create more or less points. And these points have some attributes that copy to points node understand. If I were to middle mouse button, and here as you can see we are creating quite a lot attribute. We are creating the normals, we are creating this orient attribute, it is a 4 float quaternion, and we also have another attribute called p scale to set the scaling. This node will actually creating more attribute, and we can check all of these attribute. If I create a copy to points node, let me create copy to points, and in here I'm going to create a platonic solid. Another time let's change this to Utah teapot, connect this, and maybe let's enable the backend instance and connect this. These are our points, and let's view the result. And here as you can see we have these orientation, and we also adjusting the scale. If I were go into the scatter and align node and play around with these points, and here as you can see, as I am creating less point, we have less of these copies, we have this scale. Okay, some of the parts are bigger and some of the parts are smaller. And let me hide the wireframe by coming over here and change this to smooth shaded, so we don't have this ugly wireframe. And here as you can see we are adjusting the scale as well, and that is because onto the scatter and align we have the attribute p scale. So the p scale is the attribute that copy to points node understand to set the scale. So if I were to remove the p scale attribute, and I can do so by adding either a attribute delete node, I can add this and connect this in here. And in here, I am going to specifically say that I want to remove the p-scale attribute. And now, because we do not have p-scale attribute, now we have the uniform scale, which means the original scale that is coming from our this geometry. That is the p-scale. P-scale is the attribute that copy to points node understand. Let me remove this attribute delete node. And I can also turn off this p-scale if I go into the scatter and align and onto the attributes tab. Here as you can see, we have this radius attribute. I can uncheck this and that will just remove the p-scale attribute. And now, because we do not have p-scale, we are using the same uniform scale that is coming from our this original geometry. I can create my own random p-scale if I don't want these p-scale that is coming from the scatter and align. I can do so by adding an a attribute randomize node, and in here I just need to type the attribute. I want to create a random p-scale attribute, and p-scale is a float value. It has a 1 value, so let's change the dimension to 1 and let's connect this. And here as you can see, as soon as I connected this node, we have some random scaling going on. I can go into the randomization. I can change the distribution to maybe a custom ramp. And now I can play around with this ramp to play around with the scaling. Here we have the minimum scale and we have this maximum scale. Let's play around with them and set the scaling. That is the p-scale attribute. Let me remove this. And onto the scatter and align, we have this method for generating these points by using this size method, or I can change the point count method to by density. And in here, I can adjust how dense I want these clones. I can just play around with this density value to create more or less these copies, or I can just change this to number of points. We also have the option for by point spacing. It will place the points in that space. So if I enable my scatter and align node and let's view these points, it will look for the spacing between, let's say we have this point and that is the point. It will look for the spacing. So if the spacing is 0.73, it will add another point and add another point. And if I were to decrease the spacing, by decreasing the spacing, we are effectively generating more points. And we also have the option to just explicitly tell how many points we want. Here we can just type that I only want, let's say I want the point of 42 number of points. I can just say that, and if I were to enable, and here as you can see, we have 42 number of points. These are the different methods that you can scatter some points. I can view the result, and we should have 42 number of these our T-Pods geometry, and they will be aligned. And we also have the option for the alignment in here. If I go into the scatter and align node, and if I come over here, the first tab, that is the orientation. And that is the orientation. Here we can adjust the play around with the rotation. And here we have the rotation around normals. As you know, we are creating the normals, and we can also rotate them, rotate these copies around the normals. I can define the minimum angle. I can define the maximum angle by adjusting the angle from 0 to 360 degrees. I can create random rotation between 0 and 360 degrees. So it might be better if we, I think, just create another example. So let me duplicate all of this setup. And in here, I'm going to just create a box in here. Or better, maybe let's create something a rubber toy geometry, and let's connect this and let's copy this, and onto the sphere I'm going to just make my overall scale a bit bigger. Onto the copy to points node, sorry, not the copy to points, we are generating the attributes on scatter and align, And here as you can see, I can play around with this option, and right now all of them are perfectly aligned to the normals, so which means that their orientation will be aligned onto this normal. Or I can introduce some random rotation. Now they are rotating around normals. I can change this value to 0 and 360 degrees to randomly align them. And here we can play around with the cone angle to add the rotation onto this angle in here as well. And we also have the option to enable the round to multiple, which means that let me zero out the max rotation in here. So let's say use the minimum angle of, pick the value between 0 and 360 degrees, but you are only allowed to, let's say I want to allow them to take 45 degrees angle. So now they will only be taking 45 degree steps in the 0 and 360 degrees range. Or I can change this to 90 degrees and enable this, and now here as you can see we have these 90 degrees steps. I think it might be easier if I were just create another example. Let me duplicate this in here, and this time I'm going to add scatter line. We have that. This time I'm going to input this one, this geometry, grid geometry. Let's connect this and remove this sphere. So we are scattering them along the grid, and in here maybe let's make the grid size a bit bigger by going in here. And here you can clearly see that we have the 90 degrees angles, so they are not in between 90 degrees. If I were to go into the scatter and align node and zero out this one, round to multiple, maybe turn these settings off, and now here as you can see they are allowed to take any rotation value, any arbitrary angle value between 0 and 360 degrees. By enabling the round I can just limit the rotation. Let's say if I change this to 90, and here as you can see we have this regular orientation of these 90 degrees. So that's what this option is. I can uncheck this, and by doing the scatter and align we have these alignment options. But here as you can see we are actually scattering the points. For example, in here we have this surface and we have this regular arrangement of these points, and the scatter and align will just using the surface to scatter the points. I can go into the scatter and align, and I can define how many points I want. I can adjust the global seed. It will randomly place these points, and we also have some of these relaxation going on, and I can actually adjust the relaxation by going on to the point generation. And here as you can see we have the relaxed iteration if I were to zero this out, and now we have these complete random distribution of these scatter points, and here I can define how many points I like, and this will add the orientation and all of these attributes. But what if that I like the arrangement of these points, okay, my input geometry points, I have these regular arrangements, and if I were to create a sphere geometry, let's say we have this sphere, and I like these arrangement, I like these points, and I don't want to scatter the points, because we know that if I were to connect this, it will use the surface and newly create point, it will scatter the points and add the attributes. What if I don't want that? I want these points, but I want them to have a control on the rotation onto these normal rotation. I just only want to add some attributes. So I can also do so if I were to copy this, or maybe copy all of the setup. Let me duplicate this, and this time I'm going to just remove this and connect this into this point. And in here I'm going to say that scatter and line, do not scatter new points, just use the points that are coming into your input geometry, into this geometry. and just add some attributes. I can do so. Onto the scatter and align, we have this option that is called the mode. Right now it's set to scatter points on geometry, and we also have the option to add attributes to existing point cloud. If I choose this, which means that it will now this node will only create attribute and do not scatter the points. And for this option to work, and here as you can see, even though we have the mode set to add attribute to existing point cloud, we are still creating these, we're still scattering the points. And to actually add the attribute, we need to connect this onto this second input. Okay, that input for the scattering, and here as you can see, if I hover over, it is required for the scatter surface, but I want to add the attribute, which means I need to connect the second input. So let's connect this, and now it is throwing an warning, but that's fine. If I middle mouse button, here as you can see, we have these attributes and the normals and position. The orient is an attribute that copy to points node will look for orienting these copies, which means now I can go into the copy to points node, and now I can play around with these rows and columns to create more or less copies. I'm just creating less copies, and let me go into the test geometry and maybe lower down the overall scale, and also make my radius a bit bigger, and let's make this scale a bit larger. So now we are using these points, these same points that we have. I can play around with this to create more or less points. Now I'm using these points. I'm just using the scatter and align to create these rotation attributes. I can go into the copy to points, and here as you can see, we have the alignments. Can go into the scatter and align. I can play around with these angles, and we have all of these rotation controls. I can also enable my P scale. I can enable the radius attribute, and now I can play around with these radius min and max radius values to set my P scaling of my copies. Or if I don't want to, I can just uncheck the radius and only apply the rotation and orientation, and after that I can use the attribute randomize node to create my own random P scale value. So let's type a P scale. Now I can use any of these distribution method to create my own custom random P scale value. So that's how you can align your clones, align your copy to points geometry.